Okay, it's the next day since I glued on the seat tops, and I've gone ahead and taken out all the pins, and so there's just tiny little pinholes left over that I'll fill with thickened epoxy. And the next thing I'm going to do is get ready to coat this with coat the tops of the seat tops with the first coat of epoxy. I've also taken a router and put a 1/4 inch round over to all the edges of the seat tops all the way around, and I've smoothed out this corner doubler block, so now it's nice and strong. I've just finished putting all the fillets down around the cockpit seat tops, and I've filleted underneath the corner doubler pieces, and I've also gone ahead and just put a little bit of filler in all my nail holes. I also had a couple of spots where I had a little void between the seat top and the top of the bulkhead here, and so I put a little bit of filler in those voids as well. That's just going to help later on. I won't have to fill that. And I chose to just fill it right up the transom stiffener. Alright, I've got the first coat of epoxy on the seat tops, and you can see I epoxy coated right over the fillet that I did this morning, and I epoxy coated over the edge. And when you do that, you want to brush, when you do your tipping, you want to brush downward to blend that epoxy in with the already coated longitudinal bulkheads. Otherwise you'll have a ridge of new epoxy that it'll be difficult to sand smooth into the existing epoxy. So I've got everything that wasn't coated previously now coated, and tomorrow I will be able to get another coat on that, and we'll sand that up, and it'll be ready for finishing. And after I did that, I glued on my forward beam, and as I said before, I made sure I left it proud of the bulkhead so that it can be planed down to match the angle of the deck. And I've also started fitting in the tabernacle bulkhead. Every boat is going to be a little bit different, so I had to do a little bit of trimming around the inwale because my shear line ended up just ever so slightly narrower than the plans, and I've actually got a stick across the shear there to push it out. And the reason I ended up a little bit narrow in the bow was because I used a really heavy batten when I glued the inwales in, and so my bow ended up ever so slightly pointier, which brought it in here and consequently out a little bit back there. But like I said, every boat is going to fold a little bit differently, and so I was out probably maybe a 1/2 inch, which really isn't that much, and I'm just pushing it out a little bit with this beam just to get rid of about half of that. And so anyway, I've fitted this forward bulkhead, and there are 2 lines that indicate where the tabernacle will go. And on the back side, you can see there's 3 dados cut into this beam that runs along the back side of the tabernacle bulkhead, and those dados match up with the 3 dados on the main bulkhead beam. And so after I get these 2 beams planed down to match the angle of the deck, I'll be gluing in the 3 deck beams for the tabernacle version. In the fiberglass tube version, you'll have a fiberglass tube here, and there'll be a king post, or excuse me, a king's plank that runs down the center line of the deck. So I've got that fitted and scuffed up, and there'll be a line on the inside of the hull which indicates where this bulkhead goes, but you want to double check that it is plumb. And I'll also show you now my finished tabernacle, or semi-finished tabernacle. it's all glued together, and I've filleted the inside. Okay, I thought I would show you the parts to the tabernacle for the Core Sound 15. This is an option for the Core Sound 15. The boat can be built with just the fiberglass tube that holds the main mast, but the tabernacle has three main pieces here: the back part and the two sides, and the sides have been drilled out extra big for a epoxy bushing. So this hole will be filled with epoxy and then bored out to accept the mast rotation pin. And the sides are glued onto the back piece like this. And then there's a chock that has a 3-degree bevel on the back side of it, and so that's going to sit in here, and it's been measured already. And that chock is what accepts the bolt that the main mast rides on. So the mast pivots here along that bolt, and when the mast comes down, there's a bolt that sticks out, and there's a nut that screws onto that bolt, and that's what holds the mast up. And then to lower the mast, you remove this nut, and the mast hinges along that pivot axis down. And the other part to the tabernacle are these gusset blocks that I've made up. They're just triangular gusset blocks, and I've shaped them a little bit to make way for the mast, and they go in here on either side, and those add additional structure for the tabernacle itself. They help bond the sides to the bottom, and they're definitely necessary structural part of the tabernacle. And in addition, this tabernacle was going to be fiberglassed inside and out, and so I've already rounded over some of these inside edges that I won't be able to get to later on. So this is just going to get glued up with thickened epoxy. It still needs to be sanded and epoxy coated, but it is glued together. Before I install the tabernacle, I will fill these pivot holes with epoxy and bore those out using the drill press. But the tabernacle goes right there, and it will get glued to that bulkhead with a very slight angle, so that when the main mast drops, it misses the mizzen mast. And we'll get to that probably in the next video. And lastly, the other part to the forward tabernacle bulkhead is this piece that goes down in the bottom, and the tabernacle, the bottom of the tabernacle rests on it, so it fits right in there like that. And we're going to fill it and glass tape it in eventually, and it's sloping forward, so we're going to be drilling a drain hole here so that water will drain, and there will be a hole in the top of the deck so that the mast can come out of the deck. I've just made up these cleats that will support the floor for the in front of the tabernacle, and I marked that with a pen and scuffed it up, and I made up this cleat, and it has a bevel on the top of it, and it's a straight cleat, but you can see the side of the hull is not straight. And the way I'm going to hold this in place while the glue dries is I've drilled a hole from the inside, and then while holding the piece in position, I drilled through into the piece from the outside, and so now I have a matching hole on the cleat. So now I'm going to hold that in with a drywall screw while the glue dries, but as we mentioned earlier with our stringers, bow stringers, we don't want to tighten that screw real tight, because we will suck the hull side in and create a low spot, an unfair spot in our hull. So it's a good method because we're going to be filling the outside of the hull anyway, but be careful not to suck the hull in with a screw, as you'll put a low spot in the outside of the boat. Alright, tomorrow is today, and we're back at the shop, and I've got these cleats glued in, and I'm going to take out my screw. And one of the nice things about using the screw to hold this cleat in was that I was able to glue it on as well as get a coat of epoxy on it. So the first thing I'm going to do today is scuff it up and put another coat of epoxy on it, and by the end of the day I'll be able to glue my floor piece down onto these cleats, and there'll be 3 coats of epoxy on this cleat. This is the floor piece, and yesterday I put a heavy coat of epoxy on it, and so you can see the wood grain and the wood dust has created a rough surface there, but I'm just going to hit that with some sandpaper and give it another coat of epoxy, and it'll be really well sealed up with a thick barrier coat. So that's going to go right here on those cleats. And I've also glued on some cleats onto this tabernacle bulkhead, which I'm going to now trim this bottom one and get a coat of epoxy on this. And I'm going to take all the clamps off, and we'll get this bulkhead coated and probably installed today. For comparison, here's what the bottom of that seat lock tabernacle locker floor looks like after I sanded it with 80 grit and put a last coat of epoxy on it. So it's still a little wavy surface, but it's smooth and it's got a thick barrier coat, which is what we want. And I've gone ahead and epoxy coated the front of this tabernacle bulkhead, and I've sanded and coated these cleats, and I've scuffed up the stem because I'm going to be installing a block in there that the bow eye will be installed into. Here's the top of the tabernacle, and I've gone ahead and epoxy filled these pivot pin holes. It's hard to see, but that's clear epoxy in the hole, and all I've done is put a piece of painter's tape under the hole, and I've pressed it down really well with a smooth piece of plastic, just putting some pressure around the tape. Oftentimes these will try to leak on you, so you want to put a lot of pressure. And I've just used thin epoxy, and you might get some bubbles in the epoxy. A good way to get the bubbles out is with a heat gun, but if you don't have a heat gun, you can pop them with a sharp stick. And after about 10 minutes you're gonna have to come back and put a few more drops of epoxy on the holes, because the epoxy will seep into the wood and you'll end up with a dish in the hole if you don't add more epoxy. So keep your eye on it, and if you need to add a few more drops to make it proud of the wood, do that, and then you can sand it flush later. I got the cockpit seat tops all sanded down with the random orbital sander, except for the fillet. I think I've mentioned in the past you want to be really careful when using a power sander near a fillet that you don't gouge the fillet. So I'm going to come back and sand those by hand, and I couldn't fit my sander on the transom, so I'll have to sand that by hand. And the other area that you can't get is this outside radius. If you try to sand that with a machine sander, you'll just dig right into it. So I'm gonna go back and sand those outside radiuses by hand. And the epoxy coating I did earlier this morning is now tacked off, so I can get one more coat of epoxy under these cleats, and that will finish sealing them off. And then this is also tacked off, so it's ready to be glued, and I'm going to put another coat of epoxy on this cleat on the tabernacle bulkhead, and then I'm going to go ahead and install the tabernacle bulkhead. Okay, here's the tabernacle bulkhead, and it goes in right here, and I've got some pencil marks to show me where it lines up, and I'm keeping it secure in there with a screw into the top beams, and also a screw down at the bottom that comes through right here into the plywood, and that's just to indicate the bottom of the bulkhead so that it stays plumb. And the advantage of putting screws in from the outside means that I can put it in place with glue on the sides of the cleat and glue it in, and then it'll stay there while I fill it and glass it, so I can do all that in one step. So I'm going to go ahead and put some glue on this bulkhead. Okay, so because I dry fitted this bulkhead, I know that it's square, plumb, exactly where I want it. So I'm just going to continue on with this. What I'm going to do next is clean up the glue and put a nice fillet on the back side of the bulkhead. And I'll do the same thing on the front of the bulkhead. And I'm also now going to glue in our little floor piece. So I'll do that next. Okay, I just glued in the tabernacle floor piece, and I'll show you the underneath side. Got a little squeeze out in there, and that's it. I've got the fillets on the front and back side of the tabernacle bulkhead now, and this is a good example of fillet tool size. So the back of the bulkhead, this is a pretty obtuse angle, and I've used my regular 7/8 to an inch fillet tool. But on the front side, the same fillet tool would create a massively oversized fillet because of the acute angle between the bulkhead and the hull side. So this is an area where you can use a smaller fillet tool. And just to give you a sense, this fillet is approximately 5/8 of an inch across from where the radius starts to the radius stops, so that's probably a 5/8 inch fillet tool. And in fact, this is the fillet tool that I used for that, and it's approximately 5/8. This one is approximately 7/8, not quite an inch. I've started using this fillet tool lately. This is one that's supplied by B&B in the kit. And it has a small end which looks to be about a 1/2 inch, and the other end is about an inch. And I probably could have used that, but I had this one laying around, and so I used that one. Another thing I'm going to do now is fix a little crack I had in the bow. This is pretty common. Well, it's not common, but because I tried to spread the shear out a little bit, I cracked the bow, and this is not a big deal because we've already fiberglass taped the stem, and so there's little chance of anything else happening here, but we do want to close this back up. And so what I'm going to do is just run my handsaw down the crack to clean it out, and then I will push thickened epoxy in there and clamp this back together. While I'm waiting for the fillets on the tabernacle bulkhead to stiffen up, I'm going to go ahead and cut in this forward hatch. I cut out this hatch ring the other day, and it gets glued onto the back side of the forward bulkhead, and there should be a hatch cut out on the front side or through the bulkhead. But I forgot to do it, so it's taken me a while to get around to it. But what I'm going to do next is cut that hole in this bulkhead and the cutout will become the hatch, and this ring will get glued in behind that. The hatch is actually this size, and this ring has been dadoed out to provide a relief for a weatherproofing gasket. So I'm gonna mark that out and cut that out next. Well, I patterned out this hatch ring. I just traced the inside line, and I found a little piece of metal that I had laying around that was the same width as the dado, and so I went around and offset the line, and now I'm going to try to get in there with a jigsaw and cut it out. The jigsaw thought it would be funny to peel my tape off as it cut, which also removed my pencil line, but aside from that, I got the hatch cut out, so we're gonna peel the tape and clean it up, and I'll get that hatch ring doubler glued on. I put the tape on there just to try to prevent tear out. Usually you get tear out on plywood pretty bad, and I was using a coarse blade, so looks like it worked pretty well. Okay, I got that hatch ring glued in and securely clamped. Once that dries, I will give it a coat of epoxy, and while we're on a roll, I thought I'd go ahead and glue in the knees that will support the side deck, and these I've just held in place with a drywall screw that I've screwed in at an angle, toe screwed through the inwale into the plywood. And again, that's going to let me put a fillet on this, and when that fillet tacks off, I can go ahead and do the fiberglassing, and I can go ahead and coat it with epoxy too, for that matter. So we're going to get those done, and then probably we'll be able to start on the fiberglass on the tabernacle bulkhead. I've got all four of the knees filleted into the cockpit, and you can see my fillet there runs all the way up onto the inwale, and I got that as smooth as I could, and I scraped all the excess epoxy, and when that gels up, I'll put a piece of fiberglass tape just in the bottom section to reinforce it, and we'll get a coat of epoxy on it. And in the meantime, all of the fillets that we did on the tabernacle bulkhead are gelled up. So I'm going to go ahead and cut the fiberglass for these joints here and on the back side, and I'm going to go ahead and make this backing block for the bow eye and get that glued in as well. Here's the block I made for the bow eye. It's just a piece of pine, and I measured the angle of the stem and cut that on the table saw, and then I cut a bevel on the top of it, and I took out some material in the front to account for the fillet on the stem, and I used a mini grinder to take out the bottom a little bit to account for the fillet in the bottom of the locker here, and it'll fit right in like that. And so we'll mix up some glue it in, and then we're going to put a couple layers of fiberglass over top of that, and that will be a backing block for the bow eye that will be installed later. Okay, I cleaned up this backing block, and I've also drilled the drain hole for this locker. So what I did is I drilled a 7/8 inch hole through the outside, and I tried to line it up just below the surface of this plywood floor, and then I kind of gouged it out with a knife. And I'm going to fill this back in with thickened epoxy right now. I'm going to glass over this, and then when everything's kicked off, I can drill back into this locker and leave thickened epoxy around my hole, and that will give me a epoxy bushing around this drain hole, and then we'll just finish the outside of the boat as we normally would. I finished the taping. I've got the fiberglass tape on the backside of the bulkhead, and I've left the rough edge of the glass on the hull side. No real reason, just because I wanted to. And I've left the rough edges on the hull sides on the inside as well. And I've put 2 layers of fiberglass on the backing block that go from about here to there, so they overlap about 1.5 inches across the backing block. And I've got my glass down the bottom joint and up the sides. So that's the tabernacle locker glassed, and when that kicks off, I will sand this to smooth it all out, and at that point we'll be ready to glue in the tabernacle. And meanwhile, today the tabernacle holes have been filled, and that epoxy has kicked off. So now we've got 2 filled tabernacle holes, and we're going to drill those out on the drill press.